In the summer of 1994, 28,000 people drove across America to visit a car factory in a Tennessee town of 1,000 residents. They camped in fields beside the assembly plant. They lined up in the heat to watch cars like their own being born. They shook hands with the workers who had built them. No American car company had ever seen anything like it. Most never will. 15 years later, that same brand was being erased, its showrooms dark, its name struck from the books of General Motors. Saturn did not die because the cars failed. The cars were the one part that worked. It was strangled, slowly and deliberately, by the company that created it. This is the story of a $5 billion dream, and of the parent company that built it and then dismantled it. And that is the riddle at the center of it all. General Motors spent $5 billion to build a different kind of car company. The cars sold. The owners stayed loyal in numbers Detroit had not seen in a generation. Then, piece by piece, decision by decision, GM took apart everything that money had bought. The independent factory, the union partnership, the engineering, the identity. Some blamed the cars. Some blamed the union. Some blamed the men in the boardroom who looked at their own child and saw a rival. By the end of this story, you will know where the evidence points. It begins in a Detroit that was losing a war it did not want to name. In the early 1980s, the sound of Detroit was changing. Out in the parking lots of America, the rumble of the V8 was giving way to something quieter. Honda Civics, Toyota Corollas, Datsuns, small cars that started every cold morning, sipped fuel, and asked nothing of their owners but gas and oil. Year after year, they took another slice of the market, and with it something harder to measure and far harder to win back: trust. General Motors felt that loss more deeply than anyone, because for half a century GM had owned that trust outright. Inside the corporation, an engineer named Alex Mayer began quiet discussions of a revolutionary small car project in June of 1982. The project took a code name borrowed from the rockets that had carried Americans to the moon: Saturn. In November of 1983, Chairman Roger Smith announced the idea to the world, and a demonstration car followed about a year later. For a while, the plan was to sell it as a Chevrolet or a Pontiac. Then came the harder truth. If Saturn rolled out as just another GM car, it would be judged like every other GM car, and it would lose. So on January 7, 1985, General Motors did something it had not done in generations. It founded an entirely new car company. Roger Smith did not undersell the moment. He called Saturn the key to GM's long-term competitiveness, its survival, its success as a domestic producer. Not one project among many. The key. The new company would have its own factory, its own dealer network, its own engine, its own separate agreement with the United Auto Workers. The Saturn rocket had once carried America past the Soviet Union. The Saturn car was supposed to carry America past Japan. The new company needed a home, and the search became a national contest. More than 36 sites across the country fought for the prize, with governors making personal pitches and towns promising the moon. In the summer of 1985, Governor Lamar Alexander stepped to a podium and announced the winner: Spring Hill, Tennessee, a farming town of barely 1,000 people, 30 miles south of Nashville, where the loudest thing on most mornings was a tractor working a field. The plan announced for the site was worth $3.5 billion, one of the largest industrial commitments in American history to that point. By July of 1986, crews were moving earth across 2,400 acres for a factory complex of more than 4 million square feet. Land prices jumped overnight. Farms that had carried one family name for a century sold in a single season. The town would never be the same again, and most of its people accepted that because the factory meant futures. Jobs a son could inherit. A tax base. A reason to stay. What GM and the United Auto Workers signed for that factory was as radical as the building itself. Instead of the old trench warfare between management and labor, Saturn and the union wrote a separate agreement built on work teams, on shared decisions, and on pay tied partly to the company's success. Union leaders like Don Eflin staked their own credibility on it, and on the plant floor, the bet belonged to Mike Bennett, the Spring Hill shop chairman who would spend a decade arguing that workers and bosses could be partners instead of enemies. Thousands of workers transferred in from GM plants across the country, many of them people who had watched factories close behind them in Michigan and Ohio, and who wanted one chance to help build something that could not be taken away. Or so they believed. Families uprooted from Flint and Dayton and a dozen other factory towns drove south with everything they owned, betting their pensions and their kids' schools on a promise written in a memorandum. For them, Saturn was never a marketing exercise. It was the last honest deal on the table. The product carried the same conviction. A space-frame structure wrapped in polymer body panels that shrugged off the small violence of everyday life. Door dings, hailstones, runaway shopping carts. The television ads barely needed words. A car door takes a hit and nothing happens. Under the hood sat a dedicated 1.9-liter four-cylinder engine designed for Saturn and built in Spring Hill, a declaration that this company would have a technical identity of its own. And in the showroom waited a heresy. One price on the sticker. No haggling, no games, no battle of nerves with a sales manager behind a curtain. Buying a Saturn was designed to feel like being respected, and for millions of Americans, that was a stranger experience than the plastic doors. Not everyone applauded. The Wall Street Journal warned that everything at Saturn was new at the same time. The car, the plant, the workforce, the dealer network, the manufacturing process. Not even Toyota, the paper observed, dared attempt more than two new things on any single project. GM was attempting 5 at once. On July 30th, 1990, the first production Saturn rolled off the line in Spring Hill. A red SL2 sedan with Chairman Roger Smith and Union President Owen Bieber aboard for the ride into history. The first dealership opened its doors in Memphis. Tennessee celebrated. But in Detroit, other men were reading a different page of the ledger. The Saturn project was pulling roughly $5 billion away from the rest of the corporation. Chevrolet needed fresh models and waited. Pontiac needed fresh models and waited. The money was in Tennessee. Saturn entered the world carrying its customers' goodwill and its own family's resentment in equal measure. Only one of those would decide its fate. What happened next embarrassed the skeptics. In 1991, its first full year, Saturn ranked first in America in sales per dealership, and no domestic brand had held that honor in 15 years. The little plastic-bodied sedans were doing what 2 decades of corporate task forces had failed to do. They were winning back Americans who had given up on American small cars. The S-Series came in flavors that buyers learned by heart. The SL1 with its single overhead cam engine of 85 horsepower, modest, frugal, and nearly tireless. The SL2 with twin cams and 124 horsepower, the one with power windows and a little swagger. Coupes with pop-up headlights that winked at the road. Wagons from 1993 for families who needed the space but not the size. And at the bottom sat the famous bare-bones base car. A manual transmission, cloth seats, crank windows, and in some years not even a passenger side mirror. People laugh about that car now. They also report, with a certain pride, that it refused to die. It drank a little oil as the miles piled up, the way those small engines tended to, and the faithful simply kept a quart in the trunk and topped it off between changes. In 1993, the 500,000th Saturn came off the line, and the workers gave that car a name, Carla. In 1994, the brand delivered more than 286,000 vehicles, the best year it would ever have, and turned a profit doing it. Then came June of that year, and the moment this story opened with, Saturn invited its owners home. 28,000 of them came to Spring Hill, families in tow, from every corner of the country. They walked the assembly line and watched space frames descend to the people who dressed them. They filled a Tennessee field with nearly identical sedans, and somehow every family found its own. Wynonna Judd sang from a stage on the factory lawn. It was not a product launch. It was a family reunion held by a corporation, and nothing like it had happened in the industry before. The momentum seemed real. May of 1995 brought the 1 millionth car. In 1996, Saturn retailers began handling the EV1, General Motors' electric experiment, as if the future naturally belonged in Saturn showrooms. The company even tried Japan itself, building right-hand drive cars for Japanese buyers. Japan, deep in its own lost decade, barely answered, and the leftover right-hand drive wagons found a stranger second life delivering mail for the United States Postal Service. In January of 1999, the 2 millionth Saturn was built. 2 million cars on trust, not hype. The S-Series itself kept evolving in small, careful steps. A second generation freshened the sedans in 1996. In 1999, the coupe gained a clever third door, a small rear-hinged panel behind the driver so an owner could load a child seat or a toolbox without folding in half. By then, Saturn had also become the first General Motors nameplate in North America to build right-hand drive cars on the same line as left-hand drive ones. None of it was flashy. All of it was useful. That was how Saturn earned its owners year after year. And yet, underneath the festival, the numbers told a quieter story. Sales never reached the targets GM had drawn in the optimistic years, because a recession met the launch head-on. The factory had cost far more than the Japanese transplant plants it was built to fight, and one number was more dangerous than all the rest. Roughly 41% of Saturn buyers already owned a GM car. For every Honda customer Saturn conquered, it was also reaching into Chevrolet's pocket. The divisions that had watched $5 billion leave for Tennessee now watched Saturn take their customers too. So here is a question worth sitting with. When a corporation builds a new brand to fight an outside enemy, and the new brand starts feeding on its own family, is that genius, or is it a slow form of suicide? Leave your answer in the comments. The consequence arrived not as a memo, but as silence. Through the entire decade, Saturn sold essentially one car, the S-Series, in sedan, coupe, and wagon clothing. Owners asked for something larger to grow into. Retailers begged for new product. The money never came. The corporation that had paid so much to build the cradle would not pay for the child to grow. By the end of the 90s, the S-Series was visibly aging, and the patience of GM's leadership was aging faster. When new product finally arrived in 2000, it came with a different birth certificate. The L-Series was a mid-size sedan built not in Spring Hill but in Wilmington, Delaware, on a platform shared with the Opel Vectra of Europe. For the first time, a Saturn was not born in Tennessee, and the people who had once made the pilgrimage to Spring Hill understood exactly what that meant. The plant that had been the soul of the brand was now merely an option. Even the name stumbled out of the gate. Saturn planned to call the new cars LS, until the conflict with Lincoln's LS sedan forced a retreat to L200 and L300. The car itself landed in no man's land, not cheap enough to be practical, not different enough to be loved, and its reputation never recovered from a defect in the tail lamp assemblies, where heat from the brake lights could slowly warp the plastic housing until the lights themselves went dark. The recall covered roughly 291,000 cars. Production ended in 2005, and few mourned it. The View crossover of 2002 fared better, because America was climbing into taller vehicles, and Saturn finally had one to offer. It kept the polymer panels and the space frame idea. Its early buyers also met a continuously variable transmission that failed often enough to become a warning passed from one owner to the next, until General Motors extended the warranty and quietly let it go. But under the skin, it drew ever more deeply from the corporate parts shelf, and by 2004, its V6 engine came from Honda. Think about that for a moment. The company founded to beat Japan was buying its engine from Japan. Then came the hardest replacement of all. In 2003, the Ion took over from the S-Series, the car that had carried the entire Saturn ID on its back for 12 years. The Ion tried to be different. Its quad-coupe body hid two small rear doors hinged at the back, so the side of the car opened like a cabinet and swallowed lumber, strollers, and grandchildren with equal ease. Its gauges sat in the center of the dash, A very Saturn kind of strange. The Ion Redline packed a supercharged engine drawn from the same shelf as Chevrolet's hottest small car. And on October 17, 2003, a heavily modified Ion Redline ran better than 212 miles per hour on the Bonneville Salt Flats, a class record on the salt. None of it was enough. Buyers who had loved the S-Series for its honest simplicity found the Ion coarse and ordinary. And ordinary was the one thing a Saturn could never afford to be. In 2003, its first year, production of the Ion had to be halted for 3 weeks because unsold cars were stacking up on dealer lots. And years after the last one sold, the Ion would carry one more thing its owners never chose. Its ignition switch was among the defective parts that General Motors had known about and stayed silent on, a flaw later tied to crashes and to deaths, and swept into one of the largest safety recalls in the country's history. The car wore the badge. It no longer carried the idea. By then, the faith was cracking from the floor up as well. In 1999, Spring Hill workers voted out the cooperative union leadership that had run the plant since the beginning, Mike Bennett among them, and chose officers who promised to stop cooperating and start fighting. The decisive blow fell quietly. In March of 2004, General Motors and the United Auto Workers dissolved the special labor agreement that had governed Spring Hill since the beginning. The work teams, the shared decisions, the sense of being partners in an experiment rather than line items in a budget. Deleted, with signatures. The plant became just another GM facility, and the people inside it became headcount. The following year made the new direction plain to anyone walking a showroom. The Relay, Saturn's first minivan, was a near twin of the Chevrolet Uplander, built not in Tennessee but in Doraville, Georgia. It sold poorly and died young. The rebadging era had begun, and it no longer bothered to hide. Between 2006 and 2008, General Motors handed Saturn the best-looking lineup in its history, in the least Saturn one. The Sky Roadster sat low and beautiful, a two-seat soft top that finally made people stop and stare at a Saturn for its styling rather than its body panels. It was also a Pontiac Solstice in different clothes, built in Wilmington, so close to its sibling that Europe's Opel GT was spun from the same design. The Aura sedan was handsome and grown up with a 3.6-liter V6 of roughly 250 horsepower in its strongest form, and it won North American Car of the Year for 2007. A genuine honor arriving at the worst possible moment. Like the rest of the new lineup, it was built far from Spring Hill, this time in Kansas City. The Outlook, a big 3-row family crossover, came out of Lansing, Michigan, sharing its bones with the GMC Acadia and the Buick Enclave. The second-generation View was a rebadged Opel Antara, assembled in Ramos Arizpe, Mexico, softer and more fashionable and further than ever from Spring Hill. The Astra hatchback was not even translated. It was an Opel imported whole from Antwerp, Belgium, sold with its European accent intact. Several of them were good cars. That was never the problem. Walk that showroom and ask what made any of them a Saturn, and the truthful answer was a logo and a payment plan. After 2007, not one Saturn carried the dent-resistant plastic panels that had started it all. The single most recognizable promise the company ever made, the thing strangers smacked in parking lots just to watch nothing happen, was quietly retired without a eulogy. The Saturn production lines at Spring Hill itself had gone quiet that spring, retooled for other GM products. Even the slogans confessed the confusion. Rethink American. Then simply, rethink. The brand kept asking America to rethink, while inside General Motors, there was less and less left to think about. So here is a question for the loyalists in the audience. If you could park one in your garage today, would it be an early S-Series, homely, simple, and nearly indestructible, or a Sky, gorgeous and rootless? Make your case in the comments. Then the economy went over the edge. Fuel prices spiked, credit froze, and showrooms across America went silent in the fall of 2008. For General Motors, this was no longer a debate about any one brand. It was a fight for the survival of the corporation itself. On December 2, 2008, GM told the United States Congress it would concentrate on four core brands: Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, GMC. Saturn, Pontiac, Hummer, and Saab were to be sold, consolidated, or closed. For Saturn dealers, every day after that announcement carried a countdown. Customers walked in with questions no salesman could answer. Will the brand exist next year? Will there be parts? What happens to my warranty? What is this car worth if the name on the sign comes down? Some of those dealers had sold nothing but Saturns for nearly 2 decades. They kept birthday lists. They knew their customers' grandchildren by name. Now they stood under the same signs, doing quiet arithmetic on how many months of inventory stood between them and an empty lot. One hope remained, and its name was Penske. In June of 2009, GM agreed to sell the Saturn brand to Penske Automotive Group, the dealer empire that already distributed smart cars across America. On paper, it sounded workable. The stores might survive. The community might survive. But a car brand cannot live on signs and goodwill. It needs a steady pipeline of new vehicles arriving year after year, and Penske owned no factories. The search for a manufacturing partner led to Renault's Samsung of Korea and to the Renault-Nissan alliance, and the talks died there, in large part on objections from the Nissan side. On September 30, 2009, Penske walked away. The line had already stopped. The last Saturn was built on October 7, 2009. Canada's 46 Saturn dealerships closed by the end of that year. On October 31, 2010, the final franchises ended and Saturn ceased to exist 25 years after its founding. A few months before the end, GM began offering Saturn owners $2,000 toward a new Chevrolet, Buick, Cadillac, or GMC. The company that had once invited its owners to drive home to Tennessee was now paying them to move on. Saturn leaves behind one of the cleanest paradoxes in American business. In its first decade, it did nearly everything Detroit swore could not be done. It built a small American car that people trusted with their daughters and their savings. It built a dealership experience that people did not dread. It built the only factory in the country that customers visited on vacation, the way other families visited national parks. In its second decade, every one of those achievements was unwound, one decision at a time, by the corporation that owned them. By the end, the brand was a badge on other companies' cars, and a badge alone is never worth saving. So who killed Saturn? Be careful with the easy answer. The men in the boardroom were not cartoon villains. Saturn never consistently earned back its investment. Its factory cost more to build than the Japanese plants it was meant to fight. Its sales missed the early projections, and a recession was waiting at the launch ramp. Nearly half its conquests came out of GM's own showrooms, and the $5 billion it consumed was $5 billion that Chevrolet and Pontiac never saw in the very years their own lineups were growing stale. A finance man staring at those numbers in the late 90s was not a fool to ask why this experiment deserved more money than the divisions that paid the bills. The people who defend those decisions have a real case, and any fair telling of this story has to admit it. But the other side of the ledger is heavier. General Motors starved Saturn of new models for an entire decade, then blamed the brand for growing old. It dissolved the labor partnership that made Spring Hill work, then wondered where the spirit had gone. It swapped engineering for rebadging, then acted surprised when customers could no longer tell the difference between a Saturn and anything else on the lot. A brand is a promise. The moment leadership begins running a promise as a cost center, the promise is already broken, and everything after that is bookkeeping. By 2008, Saturn was no longer a different kind of car company. It was a word on a grill, and when the flood came for Detroit, words did not float. The deepest loss never appeared on a balance sheet. It belonged to Spring Hill, a town of 1,000 that bet its name on an idea, not just a payroll. The factory itself survived and stands busy today, building Cadillacs, including electric ones, and the highway outside is still called Saturn Parkway. The rocket name has now outlived the car company, the same way it outlived the moon program before it. As for the rest, the polymer panels, the one-price handshake, the summer when 28,000 families drove to Tennessee to thank a factory, those are memories now, traded at car shows and in comment sections. They are also evidence, proof that American manufacturing could reinvent itself, earn back trust, and build a community around the simple act of doing the job right. The proof still stands. The corporation that produced it chose not to believe its own evidence. That may be the truest epitaph anyone can write. People who owned those early cars still say the same thing about them, almost word for word. They were simple. They were honest. They did not make you feel foolish for trusting them. Nobody says that about a badge. Saturn showed General Motors exactly how to win. And General Motors decided it could not afford to. If a Saturn ever sat in your driveway, tell us about it in the comments. The model, the year, what it survived, and whether you ever made the drive to Spring Hill. And if you spent your working years on an assembly line, any badge, your story belongs here too. These histories only stay alive when the people who lived them write them down. Share this one with somebody who still remembers the one-price handshake. And subscribe, because the empires keep falling and somebody has to keep the record straight. We read every comment, and we will see you in the next one.